Hey students, welcome to Module 5. And this week we're going to be covering psychological horror. That's part 1. We're going to be taking 2 weeks to cover it. Now, first off, we have a discussion. So, what's your favorite psychological horror film? Put that in there. Talk about why. And one note here, and I'll talk about this in the lecture, is the Saw films aren't really psychological horror films unless Jigsaw is actually a ghost and killing people with his mind. Then it's a psychological horror film. Okay, and Seven, which we already watched, is not a psychological horror film either. The killer is crazy. Okay, and he's killing people in crazy ways, but that's not really the focus of the film. And plus, most killers in horror films are crazy. I mean, there probably are a few that aren't, but most of the time they are. That doesn't just make it a psychological horror film. Anyway, I'm going to go do the lecture, and then you folks you'll know what I'm talking about. I think I can skip through here. There we go. Okay, so warning. Okay, everything you know about psychological horror films is wrong. Well, maybe not everything, but a lot of things you know about it. So a psychological horror film is not a film that messes with your mind. Okay, that is the definition of any horror film. That's the whole point of a horror film. It's going to mess with your mind and make you scared and yet love it at the same time. That's pure mind manipulation, and that's just what horror films do. So a psychological horror film is a different thing. It's also not a film about a deranged killer who kills people because he's crazy, like Seven, which I was just talking about. That's a thriller that happens to have a crazy killer in it, like most of them. Or it could be a slasher film as well, because that's, Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. They're crazy. They're messed up in the mind, and they're killing people with machetes or strangling them or whatever else. But that doesn't make them psychological horror films. Okay, they're just horror films of a different type. But if the deranged killer is already dead and not a zombie, killing people in their sleep and manipulating them into doing stupid things until they think they are crazy, then we are on the right track. And yes, that is a picture of Freddy Krueger, because Freddy Krueger, they kind of took the slasher mold, but it's like, wait, what if the slasher is already dead? And Jason Voorhees was kind of already dead, but not really. And if so, you could call him a zombie. Whereas Freddy Krueger isn't a zombie. He's, an entity, some sort of spiritual entity that gets into people's dreams and then gets revenge on them, all that kind of stuff. But there definitely is a psychological horror aspect to this, because he uses people's minds in order to drive them crazy. Okay, in a psychological horror film, the horror is going to come from the mind, and usually the main character. So if the main character is feeling some sort of mental disturbance, and they very often aren't necessarily the killer, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, then it's a psychological horror film. But it really has to originate in the mind. Okay, and the picture I have right here is from the movie The Cell, which is very much like a pure psychological horror film, because they literally have to go inside the mind of the killer to try to find out where he has hidden the last of his victims who isn't dead yet. But he's like in a coma. A crazy film, really kind of cool visually, kind of silly and stupid in a late 90s, early 2000s kind of way. It can also have a supernatural element to it as well, where it's like reaching out to one character. So in the same way that a character's mind is playing tricks on them, in this case it's a ghost or something else, like Freddy Krueger, reaching out to someone and then causing the horror and the disturbances that come from that. Also, in a psychological horror film, you can't see it, but you can, whatever other sensory apparatus you need to do it. Usually you're going to hear it or feel it. It's going to be, it's going to exist in off-screen space. Okay, which is very important in all horror films, but they're even more important in psychological horror films because of the fact that you're not supposed to be able to see the horror at all in many cases. So sometimes it's off to the left or right, just beyond our vision, so off, literally off the screen spatially. Could also be inside a character's thick skull where only they can see it, so they see something nobody else can, and so in a way their head becomes off-screen space as well. And then also on the other side of a mysterious door or something like that, there's a lot of like iconic shots in the movie The Exorcist, which is kind of a paranormal / psychological horror film where behind the door you hear these screams and gurgles and horrible noises, and you can't see it, but you can hear it and you know it's going on. So that's important use of off-screen space. So important psychological horror film questions. Is it real? Because you don't know if a person's crazy or not. So to the main character it is, because they are experiencing this, they see this even if no one else can. By the end of the film we usually get some sort of tangible proof. Either that person is being visited by an entity or is suffering some extreme psychological disturbance or something else along those lines. Also, where did it originate? So how did this situation come to be in the first place? It's often triggered by external events which leave the character vulnerable. So a character has something wrong with them or a condition or something else, and then that psychological horror ends up taking hold in them. So examples are The Shining. So you've got The Hotel, The Uncanny, which is a psychological horror, kind of a stock element to it, which it means repressed memories, kind of like a supercharged deja vu. And this is something that reaches out to Jack Torrance, who's like, I feel like I've been in this hotel before. And then it hooks into him because it's really full of ghosts. Rosemary's Baby. She's pregnant, and so she's going through a very emotional time, and then she just also happens to have all these creepy, witchy neighbors who she thinks are trying to get her, and, well, they are. The Sixth Sense, you've got a kid, he sees dead people. And why does he see dead people? Well, part of it's he's a kid, because kids are more likely to be able to see ghosts and things like that. But in this case, this kid really does see dead people that other people can't, and other kids. The other kids are like normal kids. Maybe they see Casper the Friendly Ghost, but this kid's seeing a lot more. Jacob's Ladder, which is the film for this week. You've got a character going through extreme PTSD from Vietnam, maybe, or it could be something else. It Follows, which is kind of a hybrid, but it definitely has a psychological horror element to it. You've got this paranormal STD that is coming for the main character slowly, and it will never ever stop. And only a person who's infected by it can see it. So everybody else, you're crazy, there's nothing going on. But that person knows, and so it seems like this kind of crazy, just paranoid delusions, etc. Great film, good one to kind of bridge into psychological horror films, but I guess I forgot to take my encode and have it put on the server, so whatever. We'll watch some great films anyway, but I highly recommend It Follows. It's a good film. So the film for this week is Jacob's Ladder. It's from 1990. This is some kind of weird psychedelic alternate poster for it. Okay, directed by Adrian Lyne, who's more famous for directing films like Fatal Attraction, and then for the pretty much was banned version of Lolita that was made in the 1990s. So this film was actually kind of off brand for him, but that's fine. We got it anyway. Synopsis: Vietnam veteran begins having flashbacks and visions, as many veterans who did. Something that happened to him in the past is turning his present life into a nightmare. So this is a bit of a brain teaser with multiple layers. There's a fair number of stuff going on, really, really heavy subtextual elements, chock full of religious allusions. So if you've read your Bible, you're going to see some stuff. Also other classic literature as well. And also some really kind of cool, gruesome imagery, which is pre-digital. I know some of you folks don't like pre-digital effects because you think they look cheesy. But to us classicists, we look at digital effects, it's like, that's nothing. Back in the day, we used to make that shit out of latex rubber. But there's some cool stuff in this one. And also possible interpretations. You can look at this in a fair number of different ways. Okay. And this also has an absolutely ridiculously adorable Macaulay Culkin. Like even before Home Alone, he's just like this tiny little baby in this movie, and he's just so adorable. Unfortunately, the downside is M. Night Shyamalan watched this film, and then he inflicted his entire film career all over all of us. Now, I'm not a complete M. Night Shyamalan hater, so Unbreakable and Split, I think, are actually pretty awesome movies. And Sixth Sense, even though you can only watch it once, okay? As soon as you know that Bruce Willis is dead, it's like all over for you. Sorry, I always do that. I'm sorry. I try not to be a spoiler. But he's got so many other movies. They're just bad. Bad movies. And it's like he's trying to do Jacob's Ladder again and again and again, and he fails so horribly. But we've got Unbreakable and Split, so there you go. All right. Enjoy this film, and then answer the discussion questions on this, which are over here, I think. No, those are the video links. It's waiting for you right there. It's right here. Answer these discussion questions. All right. And have a good week. I'll see you folks next week, okay?